The morning of June 4th, 1942, began like any other morning in the vast Pacific Ocean. The sun rose over endless blue waters, casting golden light across the waves, but within hours, 6 minutes of action would change the course of naval warfare forever. This is the story of how one group of pilots, flying what many called obsolete aircraft, turned the tide of World War II in the Pacific. Picture this. You're 23 years old, sitting in the cockpit of a Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Below you, somewhere in those endless waters, lies the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy. Ships that 6 months ago bombed Pearl Harbor. Ships that have been undefeated since the war began. And you're about to dive straight at them from 15,000 feet. Your aircraft, the Dauntless, doesn't look like much. Some pilots joke the SBD stood for slow but deadly. With a top speed of just 255 miles per hour, it was slower than many fighters. It carried only 2 machine guns forward and a rear gunner with twin .30 caliber weapons. But what it could do, what it was designed to do, was something terrifying and precise. It could dive nearly vertically at a target, release a 1,000-pound bomb with devastating accuracy, and pull out just hundreds of feet above the water or ground. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why those 6 minutes mattered so much, we need to go back. Back to December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's Pacific Fleet. In one morning, the Japanese Navy demonstrated what modern carrier aviation could accomplish. They sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and took over 2,400 American lives. The message was clear. Japan now controlled the Pacific. Their carrier fleet was the most experienced, most skilled naval aviation force in the world. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. They swept through Southeast Asia, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. They pushed into Burma. They threatened Australia. And at the heart of this expansion was the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. These weren't just ships. They were floating cities of destruction, each carrying dozens of aircraft and crews who had been training and fighting together for years. The pilots flying from these carriers were considered the best in the world. Many had combat experience from the war in China that had been going on since 1937. They had perfected tactics. They knew their aircraft inside and out. They had attacked Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin in Australia, struck into the Indian Ocean. They were confident. They had earned that confidence. Against this juggernaut stood the United States Pacific Fleet, or what was left of it. The battleships were gone. What remained were the carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, and their air groups, young pilots, many of whom had never seen combat, flying aircraft that, on paper at least, seemed inferior to Japanese planes. The Japanese Zero fighter could outmaneuver, outclimb, and often outrun American fighters. Japanese torpedo planes were faster and carried better torpedoes. On every metric, the Japanese had the advantage, except one. American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Hawaii, knew something the Japanese didn't think he could know. He knew they were planning a massive operation, an attack on a tiny atoll called Midway, 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Japanese believed this attack would force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. They believed they would destroy those carriers and secure the Pacific for Japan. They were half right. There would be a decisive battle, but not the way they imagined. Nimitz set a trap. He ordered his 3 carriers to position themselves northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese fleet. It was a desperate gamble. 3 carriers against 4. Inexperienced air crews against veterans. But Nimitz had one advantage: surprise. The Japanese didn't know the American carriers were anywhere near Midway. So on the morning of June 4th, as the sun rose over the Pacific, two great fleets moved toward their confrontation. The Japanese were confident. The Americans were determined. And in the ready rooms of Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, young pilots prepared for their missions. They knew the odds. They knew some of them wouldn't come back. But they also knew what was at stake. If they failed, if the Japanese destroyed the American carriers, the war in the Pacific might be lost. California could face invasion. Hawaii would certainly fall. Everything depended on the next few hours. The Douglas SBD Dauntless might not have looked impressive, but it was the result of years of development. Its lineage traced back to the Northrop BT-1, designed in the mid-1930s. When Douglas took over Northrop, they refined the design. They added perforated dive brakes, those distinctive split flaps that looked like cheese graters. When deployed, these brakes allowed the Dauntless to dive almost vertically without accelerating to dangerous speeds. They gave pilots control. The aircraft had a wingspan of just over 41 feet. It was powered by a Wright Cyclone engine, producing 1,000 horsepower in early models, 1,200 in later versions. It could carry a 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage and smaller bombs under the wings. But its real weapon was precision. In a 70-degree dive, a skilled pilot could put that bomb within a few dozen feet of his aiming point. Against a ship, that kind of accuracy was devastating. The crew consisted of two men, the pilot in front, with his bomb sight and flight controls, the radio man gunner in back with twin machine guns on a flexible mount. These gunners saved countless dauntless crews from enemy fighters. The aircraft might have been slow, but it was tough. It could take damage and keep flying. It had an excellent safety record compared to other carrier aircraft of the time. Training to fly the Dauntless was intense. Dive bombing wasn't natural. Every instinct tells you not to point your aircraft straight at the ground and dive. Your body screams at you to level off, to not hurtle toward the earth or ocean at terminal velocity. Pilots had to overcome that instinct. They had to train until the dive became automatic, until they could ignore the terror and focus on their bomb sight, on putting that targeting reticle exactly on their target. And the dive itself was violent, not just psychologically, but physically. Imagine this. You're cruising at 15,000 feet. You spot your target. You push the nose down. You deploy those dive brakes. The aircraft shudders as they catch the air. You're diving now, 70 degrees, nearly vertical. The wind screams. Your aircraft is falling like a thrown stone. The altimeter spins backwards, 15,000 feet, 14,000, 13,000. The target grows larger in your bomb sight. You make tiny corrections with stick and rudder. The G-forces build, your vision narrows, 12,000, 11,000, 10,000. Still diving. The target fills your sight now. You can see details. 9,000, 8,000, 7,000. Your hand tightens on the bomb release. 6,000, 5,000. Anti-aircraft fire bursts around you. 4,000, 3,000. You hold steady. 2,500. Now. You press the release. The aircraft lurches as 1,000 pounds drops away. Immediately, you haul back on the stick. 4 Gs, 5 Gs, 6 Gs. You weigh 6 times normal. Your arms are lead. Your vision grays at the edges. Blood drains from your head. The G-suit helps, but the forces are crushing. The horizon swings up. The sky appears. You level off. You're at 1,000 feet, maybe less. Behind you, your bomb hits. That's one attack, one dive. These pilots would do this multiple times in a single day, under fire, with enemy fighters hunting them, with their shipmates depending on them. By early June 1942, the pilots and air crews of the American carrier air groups had trained extensively. They knew their aircraft. They knew the tactics. But most had never faced Japanese forces. They were about to get their baptism by fire. The night before the battle, on all 3 American carriers, the atmosphere was tense. Pilots wrote letters home. Some would never be sent. Others checked their aircraft one more time. Mechanics worked through the night, making sure every engine ran perfectly, every gun functioned, every bomb was properly secured. In the intelligence briefings, the pilots learned what they faced. 4 Japanese carriers, somewhere out there in the darkness, protected by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, screened by the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. The briefing officers didn't sugarcoat it. This would be the toughest fight of the war so far. But there was also hope. The Japanese didn't know the American carriers were there. Surprise was on the American side. If they could find the Japanese carriers while they were refueling and rearming their aircraft, when their decks were cluttered with bombs and fuel lines, they might have a chance. A small chance. But a chance. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey commanded the Enterprise Air Group. He was an experienced pilot, calm under pressure. His call sign was King of Hearts. He would lead the strike against the Japanese carriers. Under his command were 2 squadrons of Dauntlesses, Bombing 6 and Scouting 6. 37 aircraft total from Enterprise alone. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best commanded Bombing Squadron 6. He was aggressive, precise, a perfectionist. He demanded excellence from his pilots because he knew their lives depended on it. He knew his own bomb could make the difference between victory and defeat. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie commanded Bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown. 17 Dauntlesses, good pilots, eager to prove themselves. And from Hornet came Bombing 8 and Scouting 8, another group of Dauntlesses ready to fight. These men, these pilots in their 20s and early 30s, would change history. But on the night of June 3rd, they were just young men, far from home, trying to sleep despite their nerves. The battle began badly for the Americans. Before dawn on June 4th, search planes from Midway spotted the Japanese fleet. The Japanese launched their own strike against Midway Island, bombing the base there. In response, every aircraft on Midway that could fly took off to attack the Japanese carriers. Army B-17 bombers, Marine dive bombers, torpedo planes. They attacked in waves, and they achieved nothing, not a single hit. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, those deadly Zeros, shot down plane after plane. The few that survived fled back to Midway. The American carriers launched their strikes in the early morning, but coordination broke down immediately. The different squadrons didn't rendezvous properly. They headed toward the Japanese fleet in scattered groups. The torpedo bombers went in, low and slow. The fighters, supposed to escort them, ended up at different altitudes. The dive bombers, who should have attacked simultaneously with the torpedo planes, were scattered across miles of empty ocean. And then disaster struck the American torpedo bombers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet found the Japanese carriers first. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. They came in low, skimming the waves, trying to get close enough to launch their torpedoes. The Japanese Zeros fell on them like hawks on mice. The Devastator was obsolete. It was slow, barely 100 knots at sea level. It was lightly armored. It couldn't maneuver well, and the torpedoes it carried were unreliable. But Waldron's men pressed their attack anyway. They had their orders. They had their duty. The Zeros tore them apart. One by one, the Devastators fell, burning, exploding, crashing into the sea. In less than 10 minutes, 14 of the 15 were gone. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived. His aircraft was shot down, but he managed to get out. He floated in the water, hiding under his seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise met the same fate. 14 aircraft, only 4 returned. 10 planes lost, 20 men gone. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 12 aircraft attacked, 10 were shot down. In less than half an hour, the United States Navy lost 41 torpedo bombers. 82 men were gone. Most were lost to the sea. They had achieved nothing, not a single torpedo hit. The Japanese carriers sailed on, untouched. In the Japanese carriers, there was a sense of relief. The Americans had thrown their best punch. wave after wave of attacks, and the Kido Butai had brushed them aside. Japanese fighters had shot down dozens of American planes. Not a single carrier had been hit. The American torpedoes that did get launched either missed or failed to detonate. It seemed like another easy Japanese victory. But the sacrifice of those torpedo bomber crews wasn't in vain. Because while they attacked, while they drew every Japanese fighter down to wave top level, while they pulled the combat air patrol out of position, something else was happening 15,000 feet above. The dive bombers were arriving. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had a problem. He had led his 37 Dauntlesses from Enterprise toward the expected position of the Japanese carriers. But when he got there, the ocean was empty. The Japanese had changed course. McCluskey had to make a decision: turn back, land his aircraft, and admit failure, or search. Use his remaining fuel to find the enemy. He chose to search. He spread his formation and turned north. Minutes passed. Fuel gauges dropped. His pilots grew nervous. Some must have wondered if they would have enough fuel to make it back to Enterprise, and then McCluskey saw it. A Japanese destroyer moving fast, leaving a white wake. The destroyer was heading northeast. McCluskey made a guess. The destroyer must be rejoining the main fleet. He followed the wake. At 09:55 local time, McCluskey's guess paid off. Ahead, spread across the ocean, he saw them. 4 Japanese carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the ships that had seemed invincible, and their decks were packed. Aircraft being refueled, aircraft being rearmed, bombs and torpedoes scattered across the deck, fuel lines running everywhere. The Japanese were preparing for another strike, this time against the American carriers they had just located. The timing was perfect. The Japanese were at their most vulnerable. And McCluskey had 37 dive bombers. But he wasn't alone. At almost the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived from a different direction, with 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown. 31 miles separated the two groups. They were converging on the same targets at the same time. The Japanese combat air patrol was still at low altitude, recovering from chasing the torpedo bombers. The sky above the carriers was clear, empty. The Japanese lookouts didn't spot the American dive bombers until it was too late. McCluskey made quick decisions. He would split his force. Bombing 6, led by Lieutenant Commander Best, would attack Akagi, the flagship. Scouting 6, which McCluskey himself would lead, would hit Kaga. The time was 0:10:22. McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into its dive. Behind him, 24 more aircraft followed. Ahead of them, 10 miles to the east, Leslie's squadron rolled into their own dives, targeting Soryu. The Japanese crews on those carriers had seconds to realize what was happening. The lookouts screamed warnings. Alarm bells rang. Men ran. Gun crews swung their weapons skyward. But there wasn't time. There was never going to be enough time. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led 5 Dauntlesses from bombing 6. He selected Akagi as his target, the flagship of the Japanese carrier force, Admiral Nagumo's command ship. Best pushed over into his dive, 70 degrees. The Akagi grew in his bomb sight. He could see the red circle on the flight deck. He could see aircraft parked in neat rows. He could see men running. Best released at 2,500 feet. A 1,000-pound bomb fell free. He pulled out hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. Behind him, the bomb struck Akagi just aft of the midship elevator. One bomb, 1,000 pounds of high explosive. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar. In an instant, everything changed. The hangar was full of aircraft being armed and fueled. When that bomb exploded, it ignited fuel. It set off other bombs. The explosion tore through the hangar like a wave. Aircraft exploded. Fuel lines ruptured. Within seconds, the hangar was an inferno. Fire raced through the ship. The Akagi was mortally wounded. 1,700 men were trapped in a dying ship. Best's wingmen scored another hit near the flight deck. A second explosion. More fires. The Akagi slowed, then stopped. She was done. The flagship of the carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor was now a burning wreck. But Best and his men didn't see what happened next. They were too busy dodging anti-aircraft fire, too busy trying to get away before Japanese fighters caught them. They dove low, flying just feet above the waves, and turned for Enterprise. 5 miles to the southwest, Wade McCluskey was diving on Kaga. 25 Dauntlesses followed him down. Kaga was the largest of the Japanese carriers. Converted from a battleship hull, she was tough. She could take damage, but not this kind of damage. The first bombs hit near the island's superstructure. Then more hit the flight deck, then the elevators, then the hangar. One after another, massive explosions ripped through Kaga. Unlike Akagi, which was killed by essentially one lucky hit, Kaga was simply overwhelmed. Too many bombs, too many hits. The flight deck split open. The hangar became a blast furnace. Aviation fuel doesn't just burn, it explodes. And Kaga was full of aviation fuel. Within 3 minutes, Kaga was finished. Fire consumed her from stem to stern. Ammunition began cooking off. Secondary explosions threw debris hundreds of feet into the air. Captain Okada gave the order to abandon ship. 800 men would die with the ship. 10 miles away, Maxwell Leslie was diving on Soryu. He had a problem. Due to an electrical malfunction, his own bomb and several others had released prematurely. They fell uselessly into the ocean, but 10 of his Dauntlesses still carried their bombs. Soryu was the smallest of the 4 Japanese carriers, but she was also one of the fastest. She was trying to turn, to maneuver, to throw off the American aim. It didn't help. 3 bombs hit Soryu in rapid succession. The first hit just forward of the forward elevator, blowing it completely off its mounts. The elevator, a massive steel platform, was thrown into the air and came crashing down against the carrier's island superstructure. The second and third bombs hit moments later. All 3 penetrated to the hangar deck. All 3 set off massive explosions. Like her sister ships, Soryu was caught with a full deck of armed and fueled aircraft. The fires spread instantly. Captain Yanagimoto ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. He himself chose to go down with his vessel. Within 20 minutes, Soryu was a burning hulk, dead in the water. 3 carriers, 3 mortal blows. The time elapsed from the first dive to the last hit was 6 minutes. 6 minutes. In that span of time, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted. The Japanese advantage in carriers went from 4 to 1 to 1 to 3. 3 American carriers against 1 remaining Japanese carrier, the Hiryu. The most experienced carrier air groups in the world were now swimming in the Pacific or burning in their ships. Hundreds of aircraft, irreplaceable pilots, years of training, all gone in 6 minutes. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu had been separated from the other 3 carriers. She hadn't been part of that coordinated formation. When the American dive bombers struck, Hiryu was 10 miles to the north. Her lookout saw the smoke rising from the other carriers. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu, knew he was now the only offensive weapon left in the Japanese fleet. He launched everything he had. First, a strike of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters. Target, Yorktown. The Americans had hit 3 of his carriers. He would return the favor. The Japanese strike found Yorktown just after noon. Yorktown's combat air patrol shot down many of the attackers, but several broke through. 3 bombs hit Yorktown. The first knocked out most of her boilers. The second started fires. The third damaged her badly. Yorktown slowed, then stopped. She was dead in the water. But American damage control was excellent. Within 2 hours, Yorktown's crew had restored power, got her moving again, and put out most of the fires. She was hurt, but she was alive. Hiryu launched a second strike, 10 torpedo bombers. They found Yorktown just as she was recovering from the bomb damage. 2 torpedoes hit her port side. The carrier listed heavily. This time, the damage was too severe. Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Most of the crew got off safely. Yorktown would linger for 2 more days before finally sinking, but she was finished as a fighting ship. Admiral Yamaguchi must have felt some satisfaction. He had traded Yorktown for his 3 sister carriers. It wasn't an equal trade, not by a long shot, but at least he had struck back. But he didn't know that more American dive bombers were already hunting Hiryu. Scout planes from Enterprise located Hiryu in the late afternoon. Enterprise and Hornet immediately launched every available dive bomber, 24 SBD Dauntlesses, some of them on their second mission of the day. They were tired. They were low on fuel. But they had one more job to do. They found Hiryu at 4:45 in the afternoon. The sun was lowering in the west. Shadows were getting long, but visibility was perfect. Hiryu was alone, surrounded by a screen of destroyers, steaming at full speed. The Dauntlesses rolled into their dives. Hiryu tried to evade, turning hard, but it was useless. 4 bombs hit her in rapid succession. The first 2 struck forward, penetrating the flight deck. The third hit amidships. The fourth hit aft. All 4 bombs started massive fires. Like Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu before her, Hiryu became a floating inferno. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. He and the captain locked themselves in the bridge and stayed there until the end. At 02:30 the next morning, Hiryu rolled over and sank. In less than 12 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers, ships that had taken years to build, carriers that represented the core of Japanese naval power. With them went over 300 aircraft and many of the best naval pilots in the world. Japan lost over 3,000 men. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and about 300 men, most of them from the torpedo squadrons. It was a lopsided victory, the most decisive naval battle in modern history. But the battle didn't end with the carriers. On June 5th and 6th, American dive bombers continued hunting Japanese ships. They found the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma damaged from a collision the night before. The SBDs attacked both. Mikuma was hit repeatedly and sank. Mogami survived but was so badly damaged she had to limp back to Japan for months of repairs. When the survivors of the American air groups returned to their carriers, when they climbed out of their cockpits, they were exhausted. Some had flown 3 missions in one day. They had seen their friends shot down. They had dodged anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. They had pushed their aircraft and themselves to the absolute limit, but they had won. Against all odds, with inferior numbers and less experience, they had defeated the most powerful carrier force in the world. How did they do it? How did a group of young pilots flying aircraft some considered obsolete achieve such a stunning victory? First, intelligence. The code breakers who deciphered the Japanese plans gave Admiral Nimitz the one advantage he needed: surprise. The Japanese had no idea the American carriers were nearby. They were caught completely off guard. Second, timing. The Americans attacked at the exact moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. Decks full of armed and fueled aircraft. That's the nightmare scenario for any carrier. One bomb in the wrong place, and the entire ship becomes a bomb itself. The American attacks turned that nightmare into reality. Third, skill and courage. The dive bomber pilots had trained endlessly. They knew their aircraft. They knew the tactics. And when the moment came, they executed perfectly. They held their dives through intense anti-aircraft fire. They released their bombs at the optimal moment. They hit what they aimed at. And fourth, sacrifice. The torpedo bomber crews knew they were flying into a meat grinder. They knew most of them wouldn't come back. But they went anyway. They drew the Japanese fighters down to the deck. They pulled the combat air patrol out of position. They created the opening the dive bombers needed. Without that sacrifice, the dive bombers might have faced a sky full of Zeros. The battle might have gone very differently. The Battle of Midway was a turning point. Before Midway, Japan was advancing. After Midway, Japan was retreating. The initiative passed to the United States. The Japanese Navy would never again mount a major offensive operation. They would spend the rest of the war on the defensive, slowly being ground down by American industrial might and improving American skills. But more than that, Midway validated a new form of warfare. Carrier aviation had been controversial before the war. Battleship admirals still dominated naval thinking. They believed big guns and thick armor were what won battles. Carriers were seen as scouts, as support, not as the main striking force. Midway changed that thinking forever. 4 carriers were sunk without ever seeing their attackers. Battleships played almost no role in the battle. The decisive weapons were aircraft, specifically dive bombers. The SBD Dauntless proved that a well-trained pilot in a properly designed aircraft could sink any ship afloat. This lesson echoed through the rest of the war. Carriers became the dominant capital ships. Every navy in the world that could afford it built carriers. Battleships, those massive floating fortresses, were relegated to shore bombardment and escort duty. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had arrived. And it all came down to 6 minutes. 6 minutes when everything changed. When 36 pilots dove out of the sun and rewrote history, the Douglas SBD Dauntless would continue fighting throughout the war. It participated in every major Pacific campaign: Guadalcanal, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Philippines. The Dauntless and its crews sank more Japanese shipping than any other American aircraft. It accounted for 6 enemy carriers, 14 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and dozens of other vessels. Its battle record is unmatched, but the aircraft was only as good as the men who flew it, pilots like Dick Best, who put 2 bombs into 2 different Japanese carriers on the same day. Wade McCluskey, whose decision to keep searching found the Japanese fleet. Max Leslie, who led his squadron perfectly despite losing his own bomb. Norman Kleiss, who got hits on 3 different Japanese ships during the battle. And the rear seat gunners, the radiomen who manned those twin .30 caliber machine guns. Men like John Snowden, who rode in the back of Dick Best's aircraft. Bruno Guido, who jumped into an unattended rear seat during the Pearl Harbor attack and shot at Japanese planes. These men don't get the headlines, they don't get the glory, but they saved countless pilots from Japanese fighters. They were the unsung heroes. Many of these men didn't survive the war. The life expectancy of a dive bomber pilot in combat was measured in missions, not years. Some were shot down, some were lost at sea. Some survived missions only to die in training accidents or operational losses later. The sea claimed many. Accidents claimed more. But those who did survive carried the memory of June 4, 1942, for the rest of their lives. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, floated in the water for hours, watching the battle. He was eventually rescued. He went on to fly more missions. After the war, he spoke extensively about what he witnessed: the courage of his squadron mates, the horror of watching them die, the incredible sight of the Japanese carriers burning. Dick Best, after his perfect performance at Midway, was grounded shortly after due to tuberculosis. That one day, June 4th, was essentially his entire combat career. One day, 2 carrier targets, 2 hits. He never flew combat again, but that one day was enough. He had changed history. Wade McCluskey continued to fly and fight. He survived the war and retired as a rear admiral. His decision to keep searching, to not turn back when he didn't find the Japanese carriers at the expected location, was perhaps the most important decision made by anyone that day. If he had turned back, if he had given up, the dive bombers wouldn't have found the carriers. The battle might have gone to Japan. The lessons of Midway extended beyond tactics and technology. They were lessons about courage, about duty, about sacrifice. The torpedo bomber crews who died in those first attacks knew the odds were against them. But they went anyway. That's not stupidity. That's not blind obedience. That's understanding that sometimes someone has to be first. Someone has to take the enemy's attention. Someone has to create the opening. And sometimes that someone doesn't come back. The dive bomber pilots who followed knew what happened to the torpedo bombers. They had heard the radio calls. They had seen the empty ocean where their comrades had flown. But they didn't hesitate. They pushed over into their dives and did their job. And that's perhaps the most important lesson. War isn't about grand strategies or superior technology, although those things help. War is about people. Young people, scared people, who do their jobs anyway. Who climb into their aircraft knowing they might not come back. Who dive at enemy ships through walls of anti-aircraft fire. Who keep fighting even when everything seems hopeless. The men who fought at Midway were in many ways ordinary. They came from small towns and big cities. They had families, they had dreams. They were mechanics and college students, farmers and factory workers before the war. The war turned them into warriors. But underneath the uniform, they were still just kids. Most weren't even 25 years old. Yet these ordinary young men did something extraordinary. They took on the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, and they won. They didn't win because they had better aircraft. The Dauntless wasn't superior to Japanese dive bombers. They didn't win because they had more experience. The Japanese pilots had years of combat behind them. They won because they were better trained, better led, and luckier, and because they refused to give up. In the decades since Midway, historians have analyzed every aspect of the battle. They've debated what-if scenarios. What if the Japanese combat air patrol hadn't been drawn down to wave top level? What if McCluskey hadn't found the carriers? What if the bombs had missed? There are dozens of moments where things could have gone differently, where the battle might have been a Japanese victory, but they didn't go differently. The torpedo bombers did draw the fighters down. McCluskey did find the carriers. The bombs did hit, and in 6 minutes, the course of the war changed. Today, the waters off Midway are quiet. The carriers rest on the ocean floor 3 miles down. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Yorktown. They're war graves, protected by international agreement. The men who died with those ships are still there. Japanese and Americans, enemies in life, rest together in death. The few surviving Dauntless dive bombers are in museums now, carefully restored, gleaming in artificial light. They look pristine, almost toy-like. It's hard to imagine these aircraft doing what they did. It's hard to picture them diving through fire, dropping their bombs, pulling out just hundreds of feet above the water. But they did, and the men who flew them were real. They lived, they fought, and many of them died. But they left a legacy. They proved that courage and skill could overcome numbers and experience. They showed that one person, one pilot, one bomb could change the course of history. The Pacific War would last 3 more years after Midway. There would be more battles. More ships would sink. More young men would die. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The names are burned into history. Each battle was brutal. Each cost lives. But after Midway, there was never any real doubt about how the war would end. The Japanese Navy never recovered from the loss of those 4 carriers. They never regained the initiative. American industry went into overdrive. New carriers were built at an incredible pace. The Essex-class carriers began appearing in 1943. 24 of them would be built during the war. Each one was larger, faster, and carried more aircraft than the Japanese carriers. By 1944, the Japanese Navy faced not 3 American carriers, but dozens. The disparity in numbers became overwhelming. But it all started at Midway, with those 6 minutes, with those dive bombers, with those young pilots who looked at 4 enemy carriers and didn't blink, who rolled their aircraft into dives and held steady despite the fire and fear, who did their jobs perfectly when perfection was the only thing that would save them and their country. There's a memorial at Midway Atoll today. It's simple, a concrete wall with names carved into it. American names, Japanese names, men who fought on opposite sides but shared one thing. They were all warriors. They all did their duty, and many of them never got to go home. On June 4th every year, at Midway, at Pearl Harbor, in naval bases and veterans' halls across America, people gather to remember. The Midway veterans, the few who are left, are in their 90s and hundreds now. Each year, fewer of them remain. Soon there will be none left. The last living link to that day will be gone. But the story remains. The story of how a group of pilots, flying supposedly obsolete aircraft, attacked the most powerful naval force in the world and won. How they dove through fire and fear. How they changed the course of the war. How in 6 minutes they rewrote history. The Douglas SBD Dauntless has been called many things. Slow but deadly. The plane that won the war. The greatest dive bomber ever made. But perhaps the best description comes from the pilots themselves. They called it reliable, trustworthy. An aircraft that brought them home when everything around them was chaos and death. When the sky was full of fire and enemy planes, the Dauntless did its job. It dove when it needed to dive. It climbed when it needed to climb. It took damage and kept flying. It got its crew home. That's all any pilot can ask from an aircraft. Reliability. And in return, the pilots gave their best. They trained until the dives were automatic, until they could place a bomb precisely where it needed to go, until they could look at a ship 20,000 feet below and know, absolutely know, they could hit it. This relationship between pilot and machine is hard to explain to people who haven't flown. An aircraft isn't just a tool, it's a partner. You trust it with your life. You learn its quirks, its characteristics, what it can do and what it can't. You push it to its limits, and it pushes you back. And when the mission is over, when you land back on the carrier deck and climb out of the cockpit, you thank it. You pat the fuselage. You appreciate what it did for you. The Dauntless did its job at Midway. It dove when asked. It carried its bomb load. It brought most of its crews home. What more can you ask? The answer, of course, is nothing. The Dauntless and the men who flew it did everything that was asked of them and more. They changed naval warfare. They validated carrier aviation. They proved that precision bombing from aircraft could sink any ship. They rewrote tactical doctrine. Before Midway, navies thought in terms of gun ranges. How close do we need to get to hit the enemy with our battleship guns? After Midway, navies thought in terms of aircraft range. How far can our planes fly? Because the carrier that struck first, that got its aircraft into the air and over the enemy first, would win. This thinking dominated naval warfare for the rest of the war and continues to this day. Modern carriers launch far more capable aircraft, jets instead of propeller planes, missiles instead of bombs. But the basic concept remains. The carrier projects power through its aircraft. The aircraft are the weapons. The carrier is just the platform, and it all started in earnest at Midway with those dive bombers plunging out of the sky. The 6 minutes that changed everything weren't really just 6 minutes, of course. They were the culmination of years of training, years of aircraft development, months of preparation, hours of searching, and moments of incredible courage. But those 6 minutes, from the first dive to the last hit, were when theory became reality, when training became action, when everything came together. In those 6 minutes, 37 pilots and their gunners dove on 3 enemy carriers and destroyed all 3. Not damaged, not hurt. Destroyed. Put them out of the war permanently, killed more than 2,000 Japanese sailors, destroyed over 200 aircraft, eliminated 3/4 of Japanese carrier capability in the Pacific. And they did it with just bombs. No torpedoes, no missiles, no complex weapons, just gravity and high explosive. Drop a 1,000-pound bomb from high enough, aim it precisely enough, and it will penetrate a carrier's flight deck. It will detonate in the hangar, and if the carrier is loaded with fuel and ammunition, that one bomb will start a cascade. Fire spreading, ammunition cooking off, more explosions. the carrier destroying itself. That's what happened to all 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. The American bombs started the destruction, but the carrier's own munitions finished the job. The Japanese had loaded their carriers for offensive operations. They had armed their aircraft with bombs and torpedoes. They had fueled them for long-range strikes. And all that ordnance, all that fuel was on deck or in the hangar when the American bombs hit. The carriers became their own crematoriums. Could the Japanese have prevented this? Perhaps. If their combat air patrol had stayed at altitude, if their lookouts had spotted the dive bombers sooner, if they had launched their strike 5 minutes earlier, clearing the decks of armed aircraft, there are a dozen small changes that might have altered the outcome. But they didn't make those changes. The combat air patrol was low. The lookouts didn't see the dive bombers in time. The decks were still crowded, and so the attack succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. None of the American pilots expected to destroy 3 carriers in one attack. They hoped for hits. They hoped to damage the Japanese fleet, but to actually sink 3 carriers, that was beyond their wildest expectations. Yet that's what they did, and when they landed back on their carriers, when they climbed out of their cockpits, they were exhausted but exhilarated. They had seen their bombs hit. They had seen the explosions. They knew they had done damage, but they didn't yet know how much. It would be hours before reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the full extent of the destruction. 3 carriers sunk or sinking, the 4th damaged and fleeing. The celebrations on the American carriers that night were muted. Yes, they had won a great victory, but they had also lost friends. The torpedo bomber squadrons had been massacred, 41 aircraft lost, 82 men gone. Each one of those men had friends, not shipmates, people who cared about them. Their bunks were empty. Their lockers would be cleaned out. Their personal effects would be sent home. War is like that. Victory and loss mixed together. You win the battle, but lose your friends. You achieve your mission, but pay a terrible price. There's no clean victory. There's only survival and memory. The pilots who flew at Midway carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Some talked about it freely. Some never spoke of it. Some had nightmares for decades. The images of ships burning, of planes falling, of men dying, those images don't fade. They're burned into memory as surely as the Japanese carriers burned that day. But they also carried pride. They had done something incredible, something that would be remembered as long as people study military history. They had turned the tide of the war. They had proven themselves. They had shown that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. And they had flown the Dauntless, the aircraft that history would call the most successful dive bomber of the war, the aircraft that sank more enemy ships than any other Allied bomber, the aircraft that proved dive bombing worked, that precision attack from aircraft could change battles and wars. In the decades after the war, the surviving pilots would gather at reunions. They'd tell stories. They'd remember friends, and they'd look at restored Dauntless dive bombers in museums and smile. "That's my bird," they'd say. "That's what I flew." And for a moment, they'd be 23 again, diving out of the sun, watching their target grow in their bomb sight, knowing they were making history. Most of those pilots are gone now. Dick Best passed away in 2001. Wade McCluskey in 1976. Max Leslie in 1985. Norman Kleiss in 2016, one of the last survivors of the battle. They lived long lives. They saw the world change in ways they couldn't have imagined in 1942. But they never forgot that day, that battle, those 6 minutes. And we shouldn't forget either, because what happened at Midway wasn't just a naval battle. It was a demonstration of human courage, determination, and skill. It was proof that training matters, that leadership matters, that individuals can make a difference. 37 pilots dove on 3 carriers and destroyed all 3. Each pilot was important. Each bomb mattered. If even a few had missed, if even one carrier had survived undamaged, the battle might have been different. but they didn't miss. They held their dives through fire and fear. They released at exactly the right moment. They hit their targets, and in doing so, they changed the world. They ensured that America would win the Pacific War. They validated carrier aviation. They rewrote the rules of naval warfare. They proved that the age of the battleship was over, and the age of the aircraft carrier had begun, all in 6 minutes. 6 minutes that started with a dive, that continued with courage, that ended with explosions and fire and victory. 6 minutes that we should never forget. Because those 6 minutes weren't just about machines and tactics. They were about people. Young people who did extraordinary things, who faced death and didn't blink, who did their jobs when everything depended on them doing their jobs perfectly. They were dive bomber pilots. They flew the Douglas SBD Dauntless. And on June 4th, 1942, they changed history forever.